When you picture Mahatma Gandhi, what first comes to mind? For so many of us, it's that indelible image, isn't it?
Hmm.
The peaceful figure leading a movement without violence, the man who walked for salt, the global icon of resistance. There's an almost saintly quality to that picture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That image is incredibly powerful, globally recognized and
Yeah.
rightly celebrated, for inspiring peaceful change pretty much everywhere.
But history and people, well, they're rarely that simple, are they?
Not at all.
We've got this stack of material you shared with us today, diving deep into Gandhi's life. And our mission in this deep dive is really to look beyond that single iconic image.
Yeah.
We want to explore the full spectrum, the celebrated revolutionary contributions, yes, absolutely, but also the complex, the controversial, and the often lesser known aspects. It's about seeing the light and the shadows presented in this material.
Exactly. It's about getting a richer, more nuanced understanding of a figure who fundamentally changed the world. Seeing the complexities, understanding that even those we elevate to icon status were deeply human, with contradictions.
Right.
For you listening, engaging with this material this way offers a chance to see this pivotal person in a fuller, perhaps more challenging light. It's not about dismantling an icon, not really.
No.
It's about building a more complete picture of the person the sources reveal.
Exactly. So let's just jump right in then. To truly move beyond that simplified view immediately, the material you shared brings up some of the most surprising and, frankly, uncomfortable aspects of his life right up front.
And one that stands out strikingly is what's described as his experiments with celibacy. This is part of his personal life that's deeply challenging to reconcile with the public image.
It really is. The material details a practice where he would sleep nude with young women, including his own grandniece Manu and other female followers.
His stated purpose for this, according to the accounts we have, was spiritual testing, pushing the boundaries of his personal discipline and his vow of celibacy, sort of testing its strength.
From a modern standpoint, though, as this material points out, this practice is widely criticized. It's viewed by many as um, psychologically manipulative and ethically questionable, even if his intention was personal spiritual discipline.
And while the material does mention there's no documented sexual abuse, it undeniably raises serious ethical questions. Questions about the power imbalance inherent in these situations,
Absolutely.
the potential emotional impact on the women involved, and issues of consent and moral integrity. It's worth noting, as the material does, that Gandhi himself wrote about these practices quite openly.
Yeah, that transparency about something so private and controversial is, well, it's a lot to process, but it doesn't negate the ethical concerns it brings up today.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Let's maybe shift gears to another area the material highlights as problematic, some of his early views, particularly on race and caste.
Looking at his time in South Africa is quite revealing here. Early writings from that period show attitudes towards Black Africans that, well, they'd be considered deeply insensitive today.
Oh, so?
The material indicates he used derogatory language and expressed beliefs that Indians were culturally and morally superior to native South Africans at that point.
That's a side of him that feels jarring when you only know the freedom fighter against oppression.
It really does. And while the material notes his views did evolve over time, that early period is certainly significant context that's often kind of glossed over.
Mm-hmm.
And connected to this, the material explores his complex stance on caste within India itself. On one hand, he championed the upliftment of Dalits, calling them Harijans, though importantly, the material notes this term is now rejected by Dalits themselves.
Okay.
But crucially, he strongly opposed B.R. Ambedkar's push for a distinct political identity and separate electorates for Dalits.
And this opposition led to that pivotal confrontation, didn't it? The Pune Pact in 1932.
Precisely. He undertook a fast unto death, which put immense moral and political pressure on Ambedkar, ultimately leading him to sign the pact.
Right.
As Dalit scholars present it in the material, this moment is often viewed as a betrayal, ultimately hindering Dalits' full political empowerment by preventing that separate political path they sought.
So even in fighting oppression, there was this internal conflict about how that liberation should take shape politically. It really shows how complicated the fight for independence and social justice was, even from within.
Absolutely.
Let's move to perhaps the most tragic event linked to the end of his life, the partition of India.
The human cost of partition was just horrific, over 1 million lives lost, 14 million people displaced. The material is very clear on this. Gandhi was steadfastly opposed to the division of the country. he fought against it.
And yet, his inability to prevent that catastrophe is highlighted in the material as a major point of criticism from some perspectives.
It is. And the material connects this back to some of his earlier and later political actions. For instance, his early support for religious politics through the Khilafat movement, this pan-Islamist campaign he backed,
Hmm.
which some argue inadvertently legitimized the use of religion in political mobilization later on.
Yeah.
And then later, his insistence that the newly formed India pay that Euro 5 crore to Pakistan, even amidst the terrible post-partition violence.
That specific decision seems to have been particularly incendiary based on the material.
Absolutely. The material describes how this drew intense ire, especially from Hindu nationalists who felt he was being overly sympathetic to Muslim interests, essentially appeasing Pakistan.
Regardless of his intent.
Regardless of his intent, that perception undeniably fueled the already raging hatred.
Which leads us to another aspect explored in the material, his political power and, well, how he exercised it.
He held immense sway over the Indian National Congress, essentially dominating its ideological direction. Now, while his leadership was undeniably crucial for the movement, the material notes that this strong influence sometimes led to the marginalization of other leaders, people with different strategies.
Like Subhas Chandra Bose, he favored a more assertive, maybe even armed approach.
Right, exactly. The material characterizes this as Gandhi's philosophy becoming the dominant, almost singular vision for the freedom struggle. And this potentially pushed aside alternative paths that others believed might have been more effective or perhaps more timely.
So these challenging shadows of the personal controversies, the difficult political stances, the perceived failures, they don't stand alone, do they? The material really shows how they intertwine and connect to the tragic end of his life.
They absolutely do. On January 30th, 1948, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated by Nathuram Godse, who is identified in the material as a Hindu nationalist.
And Godse's stated justification, as the material recounts it, was explicitly rooted in this political and ideological conflict we've been discussing. He believed Gandhi's actions favored Muslims and were weakening India.
Yes. Godse and others like him felt deeply disillusioned by what they saw as Gandhi's continuous compromises, particularly during the post-partition turmoil, and crucially, that decision regarding the 55 crore payment to Pakistan.
The material also names other individuals involved in the conspiracy, right?
It does. Alongside Nathuram Godse, the gunman, the material points to Narayan Apte as a key planner and co-conspirator, and Gopal Godse, Nathuram's brother, who later admitted his involvement.
Okay.
There's also mention of the radical ideologue V.D. Savarkar, who was initially implicated but was acquitted due to a lack of direct evidence presented at the time.
And these individuals had specific affiliations mentioned.
Yes, the material notes their connections to right-wing organizations like the RSS and Hindu Mahasabha, though it adds that the question of sort of institutional complicity in the assassination itself remains debated.
But the broader context of the murder, as presented in the material you shared, seems pretty clear.
Absolutely. The material concludes that Gandhi's murder was the tragic culmination of the escalating religious intolerance and intense political hatred that was tearing apart newly independent India. A violent end stemming from the very tensions he spent his life trying, somehow, to address.
Okay, so we've delved into the challenging complexities, the shadows, as the material encourages us to do. But this stack of material also dedicates significant focus to what it identifies as his single greatest, most impactful contribution.
And that, without question, is his genius in developing and implementing the strategy of mass civil disobedience, nonviolent resistance on a massive scale.
The prime example highlighted as his most lasting gift is the Salt March, isn't it?
Yes, the Dandi March of 1930. It was this remarkable 240-mile nonviolent protest specifically targeting the British salt tax, which was, deeply symbolic of colonial economic exploitation.
And this wasn't just a symbolic walk, it had tangible, massive impact.
It truly did. The material explains how it galvanized millions across India and just seized global attention. It was a powerful, undeniable demonstration of how nonviolent mass resistance could directly challenge and really undermine an empire and entrenched injustice.
And the waves from that single act spread far beyond India's borders, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. The material emphasizes its profound global legacy. It inspired leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement in the United States,
Right.
and Nelson Mandela in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. It laid crucial groundwork for peaceful resistance movements worldwide.
That single action really cemented his status as that global icon we first mentioned at the start.
It demonstrated, as the material captures it so well, that The greatest wars could be fought without weapons. It remains his most enduring contribution to the world, arguably.
So, as we look back at this deep dive into the material you shared, it really leaves us with a picture that is far richer, far more human, and certainly more complex than that initial simple saintly image we started with.
It really does. This material encourages us to see Gandhi not as some flawless figure, but as a man full of contradictions. He advocated nonviolence, yet his political actions sometimes fueled intense unrest.
Hmm.
He preached simplicity, but wielded immense political power. He fought against aspects of caste oppression, but was seen by some, like Ambedkar, as defending elements of the caste
He
hierarchy,
bravely challenged the British Empire.
but couldn't prevent the devastating partition of the country he loved so much. These are all complexities drawn directly from the information you brought to this deep dive.
Right, drawn from the source material itself.
Exactly. And despite these faults and challenges, the material ultimately concludes that his vision of a free, self-reliant, nonviolent India did capture the imagination and effort of millions. And his revolutionary strategy of peaceful resistance fundamentally altered the landscape of how people fight for justice around the globe.
So, understanding both his significant flaws and his undeniable virtues gives us a much more honest picture. Not just of an icon, but of a profound, messy, complicated revolutionary whose life and choices continue to shape modern India and really our global understanding of how change happens.
Yeah, and what this kind of complexity truly asks you, the listener, to consider is, how do we grapple with the imperfections of historical figures who nonetheless achieved extraordinary world-changing things?
That's the core question, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
What does exploring a life like Gandhi's with all its light and shadow teach us about evaluating the past and the people who shaped it through our own contemporary understanding? It's a question that definitely stays with you.